All right, looks like we're ready to go. So, argument paper number 3, contributing to delinquency of a minor. How does Friar Lawrence initially react when he hears the news that Romeo is no longer in love with Rosalind? Now, we talked about Rosalind at the beginning, but let me finish these questions. By the end of the scene, how does Friar Lawrence change his mind? Second question, how does Nurse respond to Romeo's desire to marry Juliet? So, next, remember the when we're citing it, it's Act 2, Scene 3, lines 44 to 94. The second one, which is how does Nurse respond? It's Act 2, Scene 4, lines 152 to 202. Question 3. Based on the actions and dialogue of Nurse and Friar Lawrence, whom do you think is contributing more to the delinquency of a minor? In other words, who is committing the more severe sin? Finally, question 4. Do you believe an adult should contribute to the illegal behavior of a minor? What should happen to the offending adult? Depending on the issue you choose. Be sure to address the counter argument in your response as well. So let us begin. Question 1. How does Friar Lawrence initially react when he hears the news that Romeo is no longer in love with Rosalind? Okay. Friar Lawrence says, okay, so before we begin, let me give you some quick background. So this scene begins right after Romeo and Juliet meet up for the second time. So the first time was when he falls in love with her at first sight. The second time is we skipped over that. That's the part where he goes to her balcony, and he said, and that's with the famous scene of, "Oh Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo?" That's from what you hear of that voice crack. Okay, so here's the beginning. Holy Saint Francis, what a change is here! Is Rosalind that thou didst love so dear, so soon forsaken? Young men's love then lies not truly in their hearts, but in their eyes. Jesu Maria, what a deal of brine hath thou washed thou sallow cheeks for Rosaline? So, quickly. So what's happening is Romeo is showing up to Friar Lawrence's house. Okay? He's showing up right after he meets Juliet and falls in love with her, and he sees her on the balcony for the first time. So when Romeo jumps to his house, he is asking Friar Lawrence, like, "Hey, I fell in love with this girl." And he's all like, "Wait a minute, weren't you in love with Rosalind?" And so his immediate response is like, "Wait a minute, you were just crying." So he says, "So soon forsaken." So just yesterday, essentially, you were crying for Rosalind. Then he gets mad, even more mad, and he says, "Young men love, young men's love then lies not truly in their hearts, but in their eyes." So he's saying that the love of young men is in their eyes, what they see, and not in their hearts. So then he says, Jesu Maria, what a dill of brine. So brine is the salty kind of liquid, hath washed thy sallow cheeks for Rosalind. So what he's basically saying is this brine he's referring to is all the tears that he cried for Rosalind, or in this case, Rosaline. How much salt water thrown away in waste to season love, that of it doth not taste. So he's saying that you cried so much for Rosalind, and you basically wasted all those tears because they were just simply for Rosalind. Now, he says, the sun not yet thy signs from heaven clears, thy old groans ring yet in my ancient ears. So he says that he can still hear his cries about Rosalind still in his ears. So Friar Lawrence is saying, I can still hear your cries for Rosalind, yet now you're talking about this new girl all of a sudden. So then he says, lo, here upon thy cheek thy stain doth sit of an old tear that is not washed off yet. So not only can he hear the rings of Romeo's cries about Rosalind still in his ears, but he can still see an old tear that he hasn't even washed off yet about Rosalind. So he says, if e'er thou wast thyself, and these woes thine, thou and these woes were all for Rosaline. And art thou changed? Pronounce this sentence then. Women may fall when there's no strength in men. So he basically unloads on Romeo and says, I can't believe how quickly you have changed who you are. You went from crying every day to Rosalind to now not even caring, so forsaking her, acting like she never existed. And then he says, pronounce this sentence then. Women may fall when there's no strength in men. So what he's essentially saying is, if a woman doesn't have a strong man, then a woman can't be strong herself. So basically, when a woman falls in love with a man, she has to be with a man who has his stuff together, right? Psychologically stable, mentally stable, economically or financially stable. So if there's no strength, and if you change so quickly as a man, then imagine women who you attract. They're not going to be able to be strong because you lack the basically the demeanor. You can imagine basically, like, let's say, let's say your mom or your dad, you say in this case, your dad loves your mom so much, but then all of a sudden the next day he's with somebody else. That doesn't make any sense. So that in the whole point of Friar Lawrence is like, I can't even believe you're telling me this right now. Okay. Romeo then says, thou chides me off for loving Rosalind. So Romeo then responds to his anger saying, well, you always got mad at me for loving Rosalind all the time anyway. So he's kind of just trying to come back at him. And then Friar Lawrence says, for doting, not for loving, pupil. So pupil mine. So he's saying, you were never in love in the first place. That's why I was giving you a hard time about Rosalind. I was telling you didn't really love her, but you were always saying, oh, yes, I love her so much. Okay, so this is an argument between a 16-year-old kid and a friar who's probably in his 50s or 60s. So this guy has experience on his side. This guy has emotion. Romeo has emotion. Friar has experience, especially even though he's a friar and he's never married. He's obviously been around people. He's, done marriage counseling. He's married people to each other. So he knows a lot about, the feelings and emotions of every person. Now, going up top, Romeo says, and bids me bury love, not in a grave to lay one in, another out to have. So basically just saying, what, should I just get rid of my love? And he's like, well, no, not really. But then Romeo says, I pray thee, chide not, her I love now, doth grace for grace and love for love allow. The other did not so. So he's saying that Juliet loves him basically equally as he loves her. And he says the other did not so. The other meaning Rosalind. So Rosalind was not, which we say, reciprocating, giving back the love that Romeo was given, but Romeo is receiving it now from Juliet. So kind of going quickly back, then that scene with Romeo scene with the balcony scene, Romeo wants to profess his love to Juliet right there and then Juliet's like, wait a minute, if you really love me like you say you do, you'll go to Friar and we'll get married tomorrow. And Romeo's like, oh, okay, yeah. So he takes off. He literally takes off immediately from Juliet's balcony to Friar Lawrence's house. And that's where we find ourselves right here, where Romeo is trying to tell him, I really love this girl. So Friar Lawrence then responds, oh, she knew well thy love did read by rote and could not spell. But come, young waver, come with me. In one respect I'll thy assistant be, for this alliance may so happy prove to turn your household's rancor to pure love. So basically what he's saying is, okay, he finds out that essentially Romeo is in love with Juliet. And so what he's saying is, if I can marry you guys, then your guys' household's rancor, like the anger and hate you guys have for each other, will turn to pure love. So he's imagining that if Romeo, the Montague family, Juliet, the Capulet family, marry, then all of a sudden there's going to be this connection between the families and they're not going to hate each other anymore. Okay. Then it says, oh, let us hence. I stand on sudden hate. So he's like, okay, come on. I'm ready to do this right now. I'm ready to marry Juliet right now. But then Friar, with his wise old man self, says, wisely and slow, they stumble that run fast. And this is literally one of the most important quotes, I would say, for someone's life, is literally to slow down. Everyone wants to move quickly. Everyone wants to have results right now. Everybody wants to have, the success immediately, right? And so Friar's like, wait, just slow down, man. I see that you love this girl. Friar's like, I realize that this can help with these battling families. They've been fighting in the streets for years. So if I make this marriage work, then the families will be happy. So even though he's saying that, he's also saying we got to take it slow in terms of don't get carried away, Romeo. Okay, so that takes us to the end of this particular scene, which is Act 2, Scene 3, lines 65 to 94. So let's go back. How does Friar initially react when he hears the news that Romeo is no longer in love? So initially, is he happy or is he angry, right? So that's something, if you were paying attention, you should know the answer to. By the end of the scene, how does Friar change his mind? So right here we talked about how does he change his mind? He decides, wait a minute, Romeo, Montague, Juliet, Capulet, they can have this marriage that could hopefully stop all the fighting. Okay, next question. How does Nurse respond to Romeo's desire to marry Juliet? Okay, so Nurse is basically the helper of Juliet. She does everything for her. She makes her bed. She, gives her food. She makes sure that she's healthy. So she's basically like her maid, her personal little maid. Now, how does Nurse respond to Romeo's desire to marry Juliet? So now we have one guy, Friar Lawrence, saying, you know what? I will marry you guys. And then we have Nurse. So let's make sure we remember this. Without Friar Lawrence, this marriage is never going to happen, right? Because Friar, he's the one who can pronounce the man and wife, okay? Now, the second part is Nurse. Where is she at? So Nurse. So this is a scene that takes place in like a Verona street. So her and Romeo meet up. They meet up because Juliet sends Nurse and tells Nurse, hey, I need you to meet up with Romeo at this particular time. So during that scene, that balcony scene that we didn't read or we didn't analyze on Screencastify, essentially that is where it takes place, all this information. Pray you, sir, a word. And as I told you, my young lady, bid me inquire you out. So she's like, Juliet told me to come look for you. What she bid me say, I will keep to myself. But first, let me tell ye, if ye should lead her into a fool's paradise, as they say, it were a very gross kind of behavior, as they say. And for the gentlewoman is young, and therefore, if you should deal double with her, truly, if you were an ill thing to be offered to any gentlewoman, and very weak dealing. So basically, what she's saying is, my Juliet is young, and don't you dare lead her into a fool's paradise. So, for example, men are out there will say, "Oh yeah, I'll do this for you, I'll do that for you," to these young girls, right? Oh, I'll give you the world, I'll love you until the end of days. They say all the nice things, right? And so, what Nurse is saying is like, don't you dare try and do these things to my Juliet because I love her, basically. And she said, that's a gross kind of behavior. Like, if you're a man, men don't play with girls or women's emotions, right? They just are upfront, they're honest, and if you care about them, they're not acting like they care about them to get what they want and then just leave them on the side. So she's like, don't you dare do this to Juliet. Then Romeo responds, Nurse, commend me to thy lady and mistress. I protest unto thee. So he's kind of like, let me, please give me the go ahead to meet up with Juliet again. I protest. Like, please don't say these things to me. And then there says, good heart, and I, faith, I will tell her as much. Lord, Lord, she will be a joyful woman. So she's like, okay, Romeo is not saying like, oh yeah, I'm going to do that. So she's kind of happy with his response. Romeo then says, bid her devise some means to come to Shrift this afternoon. Shrift means confession. So he says, send her to come to confession this afternoon, and there she shall at Friar Lawrence's cell be shrived and married. Here is for thy pains. So basically, this is kind of like one of those hidden kind of meetings, behind everyone's back. Juliet's mom doesn't know about this meeting. Juliet's dad doesn't know about the meeting, even though, remember from argument paper 1, we understood their perspectives. Also, remember, this is not a marriage to Paris. This is a marriage to Romeo. So if you think about at the beginning, Romeo had nothing to do with this. It was just Paris hopefully going to marry Juliet. Now Paris is completely out the window. Now it's Romeo marrying Juliet. Now, this whole shrift idea is the fact that last night they met, and then today, this afternoon, they're going to get married at Friar Lawrence's cell. Nursing, this afternoon, sir? Well, she shall be there. So at first she's like, wow, like that's pretty quick. But then she goes, well, she'll be there. So she's kind of like, wait for a second. But then she's caught up in just basically making Juliet happy. She wants Juliet to be happy. Then the nurse replies again, well, sir, my mistress is the sweetest lady. Lord, Lord, when 'twas a little prating thing, oh, there is like noblemen in town. One Paris that would fain that lay knife aboard. But she, good soul, had a leave see a toad, a very toad, and see him. I anger her sometimes and tell her that Paris is the proper man. But I'll warrant you, what I say so, she looks as pale as any clout in the versal world. So she's kind of being honest real quick with Romeo and saying, I have told Juliet, just marry Paris. And she gets angry at me sometimes because she doesn't want to marry Paris. And then she looks like pale every time I bring up Paris. So Juliet literally has no desire whatsoever to marry Paris. So with that being said, let's go back to the questions. How does Nurse respond to Romeo's desire? So she really doesn't argue whatsoever. Okay. Based on the actions and dialogue of Nurse and Friar Lawrence, whom do you think is contributing more to the delinquency of a minor? In other words, who is committing the more severe sin? So is Friar Lawrence more committing a bigger sin by basically marrying them to each other? Or is Nurse committing a bigger sin by allowing this meeting to take place? Nurse also knows that she's going to this meeting without telling Lord Capulet or Lady Capulet that she is going to this meeting. She could have also went straight back, right, and told the parents what just happened. So that's why question 3 is so important in terms of what do you think? So you got to think about all those things. Last but not least, do you believe an adult should contribute to the illegal behavior of a minor? What should happen to the offending adult depending on the issue? So the whole idea of contributing to the delinquency of a minor is going behind the law's backs, the parents' backs, in order to help out a kid. We call them a minor, someone who's under 18, or someone who's basically not old enough to live on their own. So there's a couple examples. If you went to school and picked up the packet, there's one where there's a lady. She's an interviewer, like a news lady, and she finds 2 kids on the street, and she asks them, "Hey, do you guys smoke cigarettes?" And they say, "No, we don't smoke cigarettes." She's like, "Well, would you be willing to smoke cigarettes on camera so that we can record you?" And so the kids are like, "Oh, fine, that's whatever." So the kids start smoking these cigarettes. And the lady's able to record, and she's creating like this commercial, like, "Oh, kids, they're smoking, and here's in the background the kids are smoking." And then she ended the commercial or whatever, the video segment. And then eventually, when she aired it, some people were asking her questions like, "Did you find those kids smoking?" And then eventually those kids were asked, because they were on the news, and then they came out and said, "No, we weren't smoking. The lady gave us cigarettes and asked us could we smoke for the camera, and we smoked for the camera." And boom. So that lady, because she contributed to the delinquency of a minor, she got in trouble for allowing the kids to smoke. Another article that was in the packet at school, I believe, had to do with the kids who were they were having parties at their houses, and then the mom was like, "You know what? I don't want you to have a party, but if you're going to be drinking, you might as well drink at my house." So she goes to the liquor store, buys all kinds of beer and alcohol, and hard liquor, and then has her kid throw the party at her house. And all these kids are showing up, right? And they're like, the cool kid with all the drinks at his house. And then eventually when the cops come, they're asking, the kids, where do they get this alcohol? And everyone's kind of saying, "Oh, I don't know where they got it. I don't know." Well, eventually somebody ended up saying that the mom did it. They contacted the mom, said, "Did you buy this alcohol?" And the mom's like, was honest, and she's like, "Yeah, I didn't want my kids drinking out, other places, so I decided to buy the alcohol for them at my house, and they're all safe. None of them are drinking and driving, blah blah blah." But she ended up getting in trouble also because she's contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The last example was a kid who basically was fascinated with police officers. So one day he's walking down the street, he sees this cop car, and he gets inside, and the keys are in there. And he's like, wow. So he goes on like a joyride with the police car. He's driving around. He goes home to his parents' house. He says, "Hey, mom, dad, look, I have a cop car." And they're like, "Oh, wow, that's so cool." So they're like, "That's really cool." And so the kid jumps back in the car, takes off driving everywhere, and then eventually gets pulled over by the real cop. Cop, stops him. He gets out, and then when they ask him questions like, "Why did you steal this car?" And he's all like, "Well, I didn't steal. I just wanted to drive a police car my whole life. I also took it home, and my parents didn't make a big deal about it when I showed them that I had a car." So then the cops went to the parents' house, and the parents ended up getting in trouble because they didn't stop the son right there and then and say, "You do not belong in that car," and then call the cops on their own son. So they ended up getting in trouble for allowing their kid to drive uh, basically a stolen police car. Okay, so with that being said, the most important thing is reading all four of these, answering them completely, making sure you have support in each of them, and then writing those nice 4 paragraphs. I'm going to be signing off, not signing off, but stopping the screencastify now. So just give me a second here.